Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to have three incredible speakers for this evening who will be sharing their different approaches to architecture. Ginger Nolan is an architectural historian whose work focuses on the intersections of race, class, architecture, and media technologies, and is an assistant professor at USC. Judith is a research-based artist and writer whose work combines a number of disciplines, including architecture, performance, and technology, and is a professor at MIT. And Thom Mayne is an architect and theorist and the founder of the research practice Morphosis, and a founding member of the Experimental School of Architecture, SciArc. Unmaking the Grid, the title for this talk, references the notion that architecture is the continuous process of dismantling the canon, of undoing fixed ideas and patterns, and of deconstructing solutions to build and create spaces for living.
Okay, pointed it here. Okay, so many of you probably know Christopher Alexander from his work on the pattern language and some related works he did late in the later portion of his life. But what really got me interested in Christopher Alexander's work, though, was really this very early book he wrote called The Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which was based to some extent on his PhD research. And unlike a lot of his oeuvre, it's not a catalog of good design principles. It's really, in many ways, a reflection on how computation might be useful in the design process, although oddly, he doesn't really mention computation much explicitly in the book. It's kind of implied. And I think in this way that he's kind of subtly circling around the issue of computation, the book really shows a tendency that we see in later works, like the pattern language. So just to provide a little context, right, in the years that followed the publication of Notes on the Synthesis of Form, we find many architects who are kind of searching for a communicative language or medium through which humans and machines can collaborate in the design process. So what he does is he calls for the development of this kind of hieroglyphic, diagrammatic language that is derived from computational analysis about things like desired proximities, adjacencies, enclosures, openness, right, these kinds of conditions. And you can see how this might inspire something like the pattern language. He proposed what I call an anthropological machine, so a computer program that would help process anthropological data. And to translate the resulting data, how to translating that into a design, Alexander basically suggests that these spatial hieroglyphics that I just showed, these would serve as a kind of translating medium between the respective languages of data analysis and the visual language of architecture. Alexander's method, it kind of rests on this assumption, right, that, like, as we said, that the computer is better equipped than the human brain to manage complex context and problems, and of course it is better at doing various things. But the deeper problem is not that complexity is too complex, right? It's really that complexity entails conflicts and contradictions. So simply put, not everybody wants the same thing. Not all the villagers want the same thing. The state and the villagers don't want the same things. Alexander and the villagers don't want the same things, right? So that complexity can't just be magically resolved either by the computer or the human designer, unless it's by creating a kind of facade of scientific objectivity behind which contradictions and differences are simply suppressed. So the structuralist method of cultural comparison, it really kind of tries to discern, right, universal patterns that you can find across disparate world examples. So, and in that way, it seeks to kind of uncover the inner essence or structure of human culture or human settlements. And as such, right, these essential elements of villages can be kind of conserved even while people and practices and buildings and villages are kind of displaced, transposed, and transformed through modernization. But at the same time, right, by claiming to kind of transcend the unassimilable differences between particular places as well as between individual villagers who might disagree about things. By claiming to kind of transcend this through universal patterns, this anthropological machine is really also threatening to kind of erase that space of indeterminacy, right? The space of conflict, the space in which a kind of politics can take place. So that's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you very much. Oh, you have your own.
So hi, everybody. I want to thank Andrea and Carmen and Michael for inviting me. As Andrea mentioned, I'm an artist, but I did study architecture. And I did take a class in 1974. I thought it was 75, but it was 74, with Christopher Alexander. Began taking classes at UC Berkeley and also the San Francisco Art Institute. And I had met Christopher Alexander by chance through a friend of mine because I was looking for some way to continue my architecture education. And so I approached him. He was very friendly, and I approached him with the idea that I would like to study materials in his studio and that I didn't want to do a project. And he was very receptive because you can see from Ginger's talk that he actually was interested in new kinds of materials in a way that many people in architecture weren't experimenting with materials at that time. So what I did is I explored rammed earth as a construction methodology with 2 other students. And he said it was fine if I did it as long as each experiment was documented. Sadly, I don't have that documentation, but we would present our hypothesis to him every week, and we would do a new experiment every week. And sometimes he sent us to see Peter Volkas, who was a ceramicist at UC Berkeley, who was making very, very, very large vessels. And we tried some of his materials, and we also tried concrete. And what these are, there's about 5 of these slides. They're simply showing you a little bit of how rammed earth construction methodologies have come along. It's interesting to see how that work is very popular now as people are really wanting to work with natural materials. I also was in a dance company, and Christopher Alexander was actually very enthusiastic about that. He came to a performance. It was held at the Farm, which was in San Francisco. And we were using rope a lot. And as I studied with him, I realized that he understood something in a way that no one else in architecture had really understood, which is that architecture is an experience of space. And his idea of learning by doing was something that as an architecture student, I hadn't really encountered. And so I was really, really happy to find him. And I'm really grateful to Michael for reminding me about him because I had pretty much forgotten. The final thing I want to show you, if you can go to the next slide, I think it's the next slide, and we can just leave it there. I was really curious when I started to look at Christopher Alexander again, why he's not better known, because actually I thought he should have been better known. And I was trying to figure out the relationship that he had to other architects at the same time. And I think this particular piece of criticism really that I'm presenting is really trying to analyze the book A Pattern Language from the perspective of reception and from the perspective of how people read it. So while a pattern language is widely referenced in architectural scholarship, most of these references simply acknowledge its existence and fail to engage with its content. So this one is a map of all the things that they found, and it's really, really an interesting read. It's only about 40 pages, but they really looked at it from the standpoint of ontology as well as epistemology and of pattern languages to see what was criticized and what wasn't criticized and how it might function. And here's a list of all the criticisms they found. And so the article is actually really very easy to find on Der Springen, And I was really happy when I found it because it answered a lot of my questions about Christopher Alexander's reception. So that's all I have to say, but thank you very much.
I was asked to speak about the Floresta housing. I'm just out of school, just starting a firm, and I have a young student. It's the third year, I believe, of SciArc, and it's Livio Santini, who's in this front seat. And a year later, he comes to me and says, we have this possibility of a project, and I'm going to be working on low-cost housing, not public, private, right? But it is very, very difficult project, and Livio, I forgot, it's $25 a square foot, some ridiculous kind of notion that we're going to do this. And I was young enough, naive enough, simplistic enough to actually believe in those visions that drove me, regardless if they're realistic or not, meaning that we were going to somehow change the world, and that architecture had a vast political, cultural thing. And then in my education, I was very connected to Christopher Alexander. At that time, he had huge influence, especially in the West Coast, and he was invested in process, which absolutely sunk in. The notion of an operational strategy was definitely kind of part of my generation and what I was interested in, versus a kind of private, purely kind of artistic notion. So that part was okay. So this represents a very particular time in architecture, which is second, say, third generation modernist. And the belief still was there was now a global order, right? And that global order is producing a vision of a singular set of ideas of how we make architecture and how we make our cities, that are based on a series of broad principles that have to do with infrastructure and ideas that have never been talked about before, and it's global. And it's a somewhat naive, maybe overly optimistic kind of idea. But we're going to be extremely interested in a very, very personal, kind of intimate notion of room by room, because these are going to be single houses on single lots. Anyway, so we're doing this, but we're very involved in what we can do for no capital investment, very tight living space, and it's going to have to do with very kind of imminent notion having to do with privacy and public and the notion of domestic life, sleeping and eating and conversing and et cetera, right? And the rooms are going to have very much to do with that, and we're going to kind of organize it, and here I am quite organized and kind of systematic, and I guess at this level, if Christopher was here now, we could chat about it. And it's very kind of rational, kind of its thinking of how you can divide up spaces within this little, whatever it is, 60 meter, 70 meter kind of environment. But what I'm learning now in terms of localizing, I go, what's interesting here is that the wall becomes important, and the wall is an incredibly important thing, the boundary. And you kind of build the boundary first and you fill it in. Right, and the notion of ownership and the notion of private and public are incredibly kind of powerful at this time in this culture. And so that walls can become important. And then instead of building houses that are all by themselves, we're going to at least push them together and share a wall. And it's also economy, so I don't have to build one wall, we're going to share a wall. And I'm going to get a bigger outdoor space. By doing that, I'm going to produce a space, and that outdoor space is very active. It's going to be a living use space. It's not space left over. It's not space at the edge, right? It's part of the program, which is going to become important, and that's going to go way further. But even the windows are at the ceiling, because we were looking at spatially, if you can see the sky, if the ceiling keeps moving out, the room seems much larger. And so we were completely involved in how to deal with these tight spaces and get the sensibility that they're larger than they are optically. And it's just a pure kind of architectural project. And again, we're looking at it, getting feedback, and changing the next one, right? And it's going to have kind of the typical language, et cetera. And it's going to have, it is architecture with a capital A, whatever. It's part of the culture, and like it or not, it doesn't matter. But it's going to have a kind of a discipline, and it's going to have kind of a rigor that we're going to bring to it, right? That would be very different. I'm done. Thanks.